What if I told you that when the banks slammed their doors shut in 1933, the people who survived weren't the ones with the most money in their accounts? They were the ones who'd learned to live like the banks didn't exist at all. And what if I told you that everything you think you know about that survival, about how America crawled out of the Depression, is a carefully constructed myth designed to keep you dependent on a system that could collapse again tomorrow? Let me take you back to a moment that's been scrubbed clean from the history books. March 6, 1933. Franklin Roosevelt, in office for barely 48 hours, does something no American president had ever done before. He closes every bank in the country. Not some of them, not the troubled ones. Every single one. From the marble palaces of Wall Street to the dusty savings and loans in Oklahoma wheat towns, the entire banking system of the United States goes dark. 4 days later, it stretches to 9. Imagine waking up one morning and every dollar you'd saved, every paycheck you'd deposited, every cent you thought was yours, suddenly unreachable, locked behind brass doors and iron bars. But here's the part they don't tell you in school. Here's the secret that got buried under layers of New Deal mythology and Greatest Generation nostalgia. Millions of Americans barely noticed. Not because they were rich, not because they had secret stashes of gold bars buried in their backyards. They barely noticed because they'd already learned to survive in the cracks of the system, in the spaces between the official economy and the real one. They knew something that we've forgotten, something dangerous. They knew that money, real survival, had nothing to do with the numbers in a ledger book. I'm going to tell you how they did it. Not the sanitized version, not the Norman Rockwell painting of wholesome American resilience. I'm going to tell you the actual mechanisms, the networks, the underground economy that kept families fed when the official economy collapsed. And then I'm going to show you why every institution in America, from your local bank to the Federal Reserve itself, has spent 90 years making sure you never learn these lessons. Because people who can survive without banks are people who can't be controlled. The crash didn't start in 1929. That's another lie. The crash started in 1927, but nobody was paying attention because everyone was getting rich. At least, that's what it felt like. Stock prices were doubling every 18 months. Ordinary people, secretaries and shopkeepers, were buying shares on margin, putting down 10% and borrowing the rest from their brokers. The game was simple. Buy stocks with borrowed money. Watch them go up, sell some, borrow more, buy more. Watch your net worth explode on paper. My grandfather used to tell me about his neighbor in Brooklyn, a guy named Sal who worked in a printing shop. By 1928, Sal was telling everyone at the corner bar that he'd made more in the stock market in 6 months than he'd made in 6 years of working. He bought a new Buick, took his family to Atlantic City, started talking about buying a second house. The money wasn't real. It was numbers on brokerage statements, promises built on other promises, a tower of debt stretching up into the clouds. But it felt real. That's the trick. That's always the trick. The system works as long as everyone believes it works. October 24, 1929. Black Thursday. The tower starts to wobble. Stocks drop 11% in a single day. Panic selling. Margin calls flooding in. If you bought stock with borrowed money and the price drops, your broker demands cash immediately to cover the loss. Thousands of men who thought they were millionaires on Monday got telegrams on Thursday demanding payment they didn't have. By the following Tuesday, the 29th, the market had lost more than $25 billion in value. To put that in perspective, that was more than the entire cost of American involvement in World War I. Gone, evaporated, like it never existed. But even that wasn't the real catastrophe. The real catastrophe was what happened next. What always happens next. The money men, the banks, the lenders, they all started calling in their debts. Not just from stock speculators, from everyone. Farms foreclosed because crop prices collapsed and farmers couldn't make loan payments. Factories closed because nobody was buying anything anymore. Workers got laid off, couldn't pay their mortgages, lost their homes, couldn't buy food. Stores went under, more workers laid off, the spiral accelerating downward. By 1933, 1 in 4 American workers had no job, no income, no prospects. And that's when Roosevelt closed the banks. He called it a bank holiday, which is a nice way of saying we're stopping the bleeding before you realize how deep the cut really is. Behind those closed doors, federal examiners were going through the books, trying to figure out which banks were actually solvent and which ones had been running on fumes and prayer. When the banks reopened, 9 days later, more than 5,000 of them stayed closed forever. If your savings were in one of those banks, you lost everything. No deposit insurance yet. No government bailout. Just gone. Now here's what you need to understand about that moment. The official story is that Americans tightened their belts, waited patiently for the banks to reopen, and then slowly, painfully, rebuilt through the New Deal programs. Victory gardens and public works and pulling together. That story is about 10% true and 90% propaganda. The real story is stranger, more subversive, more useful. The real story is that huge segments of the American population had never fully bought into the banking system in the first place. Immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, Black Americans who'd been systematically excluded from white-owned banks, rural farming communities where the nearest bank was 30 miles of bad road away, they'd all developed parallel systems, shadow economies, ways to survive that didn't require depositing your paycheck and hoping the bank was still there next month. Let me paint you a picture. 1933. A tenement building in South Philadelphia. Mostly Italian families. Half of them don't speak English at home. You won't find many bank accounts in that building. You know what you will find? You'll find a rotating credit association called a comarca. Every week, 10 or 12 families each put in $5. Doesn't sound like much, but that's over $250 a month in the pool, maybe $3,000 a year. Each week, a different family gets the entire pot. Maybe you use it to open a grocery store. Maybe you need it to pay for a funeral. Maybe your son needs tools to start working as a carpenter. The system works on trust and social pressure. You don't pay. The whole neighborhood knows. Your reputation is the collateral. This wasn't charity. This was sophisticated financial engineering that predated banking by centuries. West African immigrants ran susu systems that worked the same way. Chinese communities had hui. Japanese had tanamoshi. Mexicans had tandas. Every immigrant group that came to America brought some version of this collective saving system because they learned, usually the hard way, that banks weren't built for people like them. And when the banks closed in 1933, these systems didn't even hiccup. They kept running because they never depended on banks to begin with. Now go further out. Rural Kentucky, Appalachian coal country, 1933. The mines are closing. No work, no money, no banks, even if you wanted them. How do people eat? They go back to subsistence farming. Sounds romantic, doesn't it? Gets taught in schools like it's some kind of pastoral virtue. Let me tell you what subsistence farming actually meant. It meant you grew everything you ate. Potatoes, beans, corn, tomatoes. You kept chickens for eggs and meat. Maybe a pig you'd slaughter in winter. A milk cow if you were lucky. You hunted squirrels and rabbits because protein was protein. But it wasn't just about food. It was about a complete ecosystem of mutual dependency that had nothing to do with currency. Your neighbor helps you build a barn. You help him harvest tobacco. Someone's good at fixing tools. They do that in exchange for someone else's surplus vegetables. A woman knows how to deliver babies. That skill is worth more than money when your wife is in labor and the nearest hospital is 40 miles away. These weren't primitive people reverting to savage ways. These were sophisticated networks of reciprocal obligation that allowed communities to function when the monetary economy evaporated. I want you to understand something crucial here. The people who survived the Depression best weren't necessarily the ones who had the most before it started. They were the ones who had skills, relationships, and systems that existed outside the official economy. A factory worker in Detroit who'd spent 20 years doing the same repetitive task on an assembly line, getting paid every Friday, depositing his check at the bank, buying everything at stores. That guy was completely helpless when the system shut down. He had no skills the Depression economy valued, no garden, no network of mutual aid, just a specialized cog from a machine that wasn't running anymore. But a sharecropper in Mississippi, a seamstress in New York's garment district who did alterations on the side for cash, a mechanic who fixed cars in his backyard, these people had flexible skills and existing black market networks. They were already operating partially outside the system. When the system collapsed, they just went deeper into the parts that still worked. Let's talk about what money actually was during the Depression, because this is where it gets weird. Between 1930 and 1933, thousands of communities across America just started printing their own, not counterfeiting, not illegally. They created legal local scrip currencies because there literally wasn't enough national currency in circulation. The government had contracted the money supply so severely that even if you wanted to buy and sell things, there weren't enough dollars to facilitate the transactions. In Tenino, Washington, the local Chamber of Commerce started printing currency on wood, actual wooden coins and bills. Merchants accepted them. People got paid in them. They worked because everyone in Tenino agreed they worked. In Iowa, a merchant named Charles Zylstra invented a currency called stamp scrip. Each bill had spaces for stamps on the back. Every week, the person holding the bill had to buy a 2-cent stamp and attach it to keep the bill valid. Sounds crazy, but it was brilliant. It discouraged hoarding. It kept money moving, circulating, which is what makes an economy function. Within months, stamp scrip systems were operating in over 200 American cities. The federal government hated this, absolutely despised it. Why? Because money is power, and when communities start creating their own money, they're claiming power that's supposed to belong to central banks and Federal Reserve systems. By 1933, new laws made it much harder to create local currencies. They shut down most of the scrip systems, forced everyone back onto the national currency, back into dependence on the official system. Here's what that tells you. The system doesn't just want your participation, it needs your dependence. A community that can function economically without relying on centralized banking is a community that can't be controlled through interest rates, credit freezes, or monetary policy. That's terrifying to people whose power rests on controlling the flow of money. Now let me take you inside a specific house, 1934, Queens, New York. A woman named Rose Mancini. She's a widow. Her husband died in 1931 before things got really bad. She's got 3 kids to feed. No bank account because she never trusted banks to begin with. No job because nobody's hiring. Here's how Rose survives. She rents out 2 rooms in her house to boarders. Gets a little cash every week. Not much, but something. She keeps chickens in the backyard. Illegal in Queens, technically. But half the neighborhood is doing it and the cops have bigger problems. Eggs for her family, eggs to trade. She takes in sewing. Can repair anything. Make dresses from old curtains. Turn one worn-out coat into a smaller coat for a child. She trades sewing work for groceries with the Italian grocer down the street. His wife isn't handy with a needle. He's got access to wholesale food. They work it out. Rose's sister married a guy who works for the city, still has a job, barely, but he's got a steady paycheck. Every month, he gives Rose a little cash, not charity. It's understood that when he needs something, a place for his kids to stay for a week and help with something, Rose will provide. The family is a mutual insurance system. Rose's oldest son, 16, should be in school, but he's working off the books at a garage, gets paid in cash. Some weeks, it's $3. Some weeks, it's nothing. He gives it all to his mother. This is how millions of families actually survived. Not through government programs, though those helped when they came. Not through banks reopening, though that helped too. They survived through complex webs of informal economy, barter, mutual aid, and sheer stubborn resourcefulness. The question we should be asking ourselves is, why can't we do that now? What happened between 1935 and today that made us so dependent on the official system that the idea of surviving outside it seems impossible? Part of it is that the system learned. After the Depression, after World War II, the American economy was rebuilt very deliberately to eliminate the spaces where unofficial economies could flourish. Zoning laws made it illegal to keep chickens in your backyard in most cities, to run a business out of your home. Business licensing requirements made it expensive and complicated to operate small, informal enterprises. Banking became mandatory. Try getting a job today without a bank account for direct deposit. Try renting an apartment without a credit check. The suburbs were designed specifically to make self-sufficiency impossible. Huge lawns of useless grass instead of gardens. Houses spaced far apart. No mixed-use neighborhoods where you could walk to a butcher, a baker, a corner grocery. Everything required a car. Cars required gas. Gas required money. Money required a job. A job required participating in the official economy. The trap closed slowly, over decades, until it felt natural. By the 1950s, the banking system had gotten deposit insurance through the FDIC. That was supposed to protect you, make you trust banks, and it did protect you from bank failures. But it also made you dependent. Why keep cash at home when the bank is perfectly safe? Why maintain networks of mutual aid when you've got a credit card for emergencies? Every safety net the system offered came with strings attached. The strings were invisible, but they were strong. I'll tell you the darkest secret of all. The Depression was solvable. Not quickly, not painlessly, but solvable through the same mechanisms that got people through it: localized economies, barter networks, mutual aid, skills development. The New Deal didn't end the Depression. World War II ended the Depression by forcing full industrial mobilization and full employment. But that mobilization came at a cost. It completed the process of making Americans dependent on large institutions, big corporations, big government, big banks. Before the war, America still had millions of small farmers, family operations. After the war, industrial agriculture. Before the war, local manufacturing. After the war, corporate consolidation. Before the war, you might work for yourself or in a small shop where you knew the owner. After the war, you worked for a corporation where the owner was a distant abstraction called shareholders. Every change made you more dependent, more specialized, less capable of independent survival. So what do we do with this information? What's the practical application for someone living right now, reading this, wondering if they should be worried about the stability of banks in 2025? I'm not going to tell you to pull all your money out and buy gold. That's prepper fantasy. I'm going to tell you something more subversive. Start building the networks now, not when the crisis hits. Now. Learn who in your neighborhood has skills you don't have, who can fix things, grow things, make things. Offer your skills in return. Create relationships based on mutual benefit, not just friendly waves across the lawn. Learn to do something useful with your hands. Grow some of your food, even if it's just herbs in a window box. Not because you think you'll feed yourself entirely, but because the skill itself, the knowledge of how things grow, is valuable. Reduce your dependence on the official system everywhere you can. Keep some cash at home, not your life savings, but enough that if the ATMs go dark for a week, you can buy food. Learn to cook actual food from actual ingredients, not from packages and delivery apps. This isn't about survivalism. It's about resilience. It's about having options when systems fail. Find your people. The mutual aid networks that kept people alive in the Depression didn't form overnight when the banks closed. They existed before. They were based on ethnic ties, neighborhood ties, church ties, union ties. What are your ties? Who would you call if you needed help and the official channels weren't working? Who would call you? If you can't answer that question, you're more vulnerable than you think. The system wants you isolated, wants you dependent on institutions rather than relationships, wants you specialized rather than capable. Every step you take toward self-reliance and community connection is a step toward the kind of resilience that let people survive when the banks closed in 1933. They're not going to teach you this in school. The banks certainly aren't going to teach you this, because people who don't need banks are people who have power. Here's the final thing I'll leave you with. The people who survived the Depression, who thrived even, they weren't lucky. They weren't special. They just understood something fundamental that we've been conditioned to forget. The official economy, the banks, the stock market, the whole apparatus, it's not the foundation of survival. It's a tool, sometimes useful, sometimes dangerous. But underneath it, there's always been another economy. The economy of human relationships, of skill, of mutual obligation, of people helping people because they know they'll need help someday too. That economy doesn't crash. It doesn't close. It can't be frozen by executive order. It existed before banks. It'll exist after banks. The question is whether you're part of it or whether you've let yourself become so dependent on the official system that you've atrophied your ability to function in the real one. The Depression taught a generation of Americans that lesson in the hardest way possible. We've got a choice. We can learn from their experience now while there's time, or we can wait until the next time the banks close their doors and learn it the hard way ourselves. The networks are there if you look for them. The skills can be learned. The relationships can be built. But you have to start now. Because when the crisis comes, and it always comes, it's too late to build the foundation. The people who made it through 1933 understood that. The ones who didn't, well, their stories didn't get told. They're just names on old foreclosure notices and bankruptcy filings, ghosts of a system that promised security and delivered catastrophe. So build your own security, outside the system, alongside it, independent of it. That's how they survived when the banks closed, and that's how you'll survive when it happens again.